I've always been the numbers guy in my family. Not because I'm brilliant, but because I like the comfort of a ledger. I like knowing where things stand. When my wife and I bought our first house, I built a spreadsheet that tracked every expense down to the trash service. I maxed out my 401k early, avoided debt except the mortgage, and kept a separate emergency fund because I'd watched my parents live one bad month away from disaster. That's the version of myself I carried into my 30s. Calm, practical, responsible. The kind of man who believes the right habits can keep the world predictable. Then my friend Eric disappeared after a money conflict, and when he returned years later, he brought a truth that made my careful life feel like a story I told myself to avoid looking at what I was capable of. Eric and I met at my first real job after college. We were both in a regional operations office, the kind of place with beige walls and fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look slightly sick. He was charismatic in a low-key way, good at getting people to talk, good at smoothing over conflict. He had a laugh that made other people relax, which is a rare skill in corporate environments. We became friends in the way adult men often do, through proximity and shared complaints. Lunches, happy hours, long drives to warehouses where we'd stand in steel-toed boots and pretend we knew what we were doing. Eric also had a side hustle. Not shady, he'd say, and I believed him because I wanted to. He ran a small investment club with a few guys from work. They pooled money, bought into local real estate flips, and sometimes dabbled in alternative stuff, small private loans, odd business ventures. Eric wasn't reckless with money in the obvious way. He was reckless with confidence. I didn't join at first. I watched. I listened. I told myself I was too smart to mix friends and finances. Then Eric showed me a spreadsheet. It was a simple page with returns listed month by month. Green numbers, steady growth. It looked clean. It looked controlled. It looked like the kind of system I respected. 8%, Eric said. Conservative. We're not doing anything wild. 8% isn't a miracle, but it's enough to make a middle-class brain start calculating what it could mean over time. I asked questions. Where was the risk? What were the assets? What was the structure? Eric answered smoothly. He had documents. He had a basic LLC set up. He had a lawyer's letter. He had the kind of surface-level legitimacy that makes a cautious person feel like they're being careful even while they're stepping off a ledge. I put in $10,000. Not life-changing. Not reckless, I told myself. A test. The first distribution hit my account a month later. A small deposit with a note. Q1 return. It felt like validation not just of Eric but of my own judgment. That's what got me. I wasn't chasing money. I was chasing the feeling of being right. Over the next year, I put in more. 20,000. Then 30. Then a chunk of my bonus. I didn't tell my wife at first. That's the first morally questionable choice, and I can still feel how easily I justified it. I told myself it was my money because it came from my bonus. I told myself I'd tell her once it proved itself. I told myself I was protecting her from anxiety. What I was really doing was protecting myself from having to defend the decision. The conflict happened in a conference room after hours, the kind of room that smells like dry marker and stale coffee. Eric had called an informal meeting of the investment group. Everyone looked slightly tense, but Eric was smiling, which is always a bad sign. "We've got a delay," he said. "One of the flips is taking longer. No big deal. We'll miss this quarter's distribution, but it'll catch up." I didn't like missing distributions, not because I needed the money, but because it broke the neat story I'd built in my head. I asked to see the underlying documents for the flip. Eric said he'd send them. Another guy asked about the private loan portfolio. Eric said it was in transition. Eric kept saying phrases like, "no big deal," and "temporary," and the room kept getting quieter. Afterward, I followed him into the hallway. "I need details," I said. Eric put a hand on my shoulder like I was overreacting. "Relax. You're the cautious one. That's why I like you. But you're fine." That line irritated me more than it should have. It sounded like a compliment, but it was also a way of telling me to shut up. "I've got almost 60 grand in," I said. Eric's smile tightened. "And you've made money on it, right? so don't act like you've been wronged. That's when I realized he wasn't seeing me as a friend in that moment. He was seeing me as a problem to manage. I went home and told my wife everything that night, partly out of guilt, partly because I wanted backup. She stared at me like I'd confessed to a different kind of betrayal. "You did this without telling me?" she said. "I was going to," I said, and hated how weak that sounded. She didn't scream. She just went quiet, and in that quiet I could feel the first crack in the image I had of myself. 2 weeks later, Eric stopped showing up. At first, it was normal absence. Sick day. Family emergency. Then it stretched. Emails went unanswered. Calls went to voicemail. His LinkedIn went dark. HR sent out a bland announcement about personal leave. The investment group started texting each other, trying to sound calm while panic leaked through every sentence. One guy drove to Eric's house and found it empty. Another contacted the LLC's registered agent and got no response. I tried to stay rational. I told myself there was an explanation. I told myself Eric wouldn't do something stupid. I told myself the money was tied up in assets, not just gone. That's denial, and it's remarkably easy when the alternative is facing how much you've risked. Then my bank called about a bounce transfer. The most recent distribution deposit had been reversed as fraudulent. Not delayed, fraudulent. The bank used the word carefully, like it was handling something fragile. My stomach dropped so hard I had to sit down. I called the other investors. Nobody had answers. Some were furious. Some were panicking. One guy admitted he'd borrowed against his home to invest. My wife said calmly, "We need to assume it's gone." I hated her for being right. The first major twist arrived in the form of a letter from the state attorney general's office. It wasn't addressed only to me. It was a notice to potential victims of a fraud investigation involving Eric's LLC. The letter included a case number and a list of alleged activity: misrepresentation of investments, commingling of funds, use of new investor money to pay earlier returns. In other words, a textbook Ponzi scheme. Reading those words, I felt my throat tighten with a kind of shame that wasn't just about losing money. It was about being the cautious guy who got played anyway. It was about having hidden it from my wife. It was about imagining the story others would tell. He thought he was smarter than everyone. We filed reports. We met with an investigator. We provided bank statements. We sat in rooms with other victims, people I'd known casually at work, now bonded by embarrassment. Eventually, the investigator said they believed Eric had fled the state. They had no clear location. They had limited hope of recovery. And then, because life doesn't pause to let you process, we got hit with a second problem. My wife lost her job. Her company did layoffs. Suddenly, our household income dropped, and the money I'd lost wasn't just a shameful mistake. It was missing oxygen. I took on overtime. I sold a few investments at a loss. We tightened everything. I told myself we'd recover because I needed to believe my habits still mattered. For a while, it worked. That was the false resolution. The sense that we could just grind through it and Eric would remain a bad memory, contained in paperwork. 2 years passed without news. We stabilized. The anger softened into something duller. Our marriage didn't go back to how it was, but it stayed intact in a cautious way. My wife didn't trust my "I've got it handled" tone anymore. I didn't blame her. Then one afternoon, I got a message request on social media from an account with no profile photo. The name was unfamiliar. The message was short: "I'm sorry. It wasn't what you think. Please don't block me." I stared at it for a long time. My first instinct was to ignore it. The past felt safer as a sealed box. Then another message arrived. Same account. "It's Eric." My chest tightened. Not with relief, with something closer to dread. Because if Eric was back, it meant the story wasn't done. Stories like this don't reopen for good reasons. I wrote back, "Where are you?" His reply came quickly, "I can't say, but I need to tell you the truth. Not the truth you think you already know." That line made my skin prickle, because what I thought I knew was already bad. If there was worse, I wasn't sure I wanted it. Eric asked to meet in person. I said no. I said we could talk on the phone. He refused. He said it had to be face to face. I told my wife. Her immediate reaction was, "Do not go. I need answers," I said, and even as I said it, I could hear the old arrogance, the belief that I could manage risk if I was careful enough. We compromised. I agreed to meet in a public place during daylight and to tell her exactly where. She insisted I bring no cash and not follow him anywhere. Her caution felt like an indictment of mine. We met at a diner off the highway. Eric looked different, thinner, hair shorter. He wore a baseball cap pulled low and kept glancing at the door like he expected someone to walk in with consequences. He didn't smile. He didn't do his old charm routine. That alone scared me more than any theatrics would have. He slid into the booth across from me and said, quietly, "I didn't run because I wanted to." I stared at him. "You stole from us," I said. My voice sounded calm, but my hands were shaking under the table. Eric nodded once. "Yes," he said, "and I'm not asking you to forgive me, but you need to know why." I laughed, a short, harsh sound. "Why? Because you wanted more money?" Eric flinched like I'd slapped him. "Because I was already broke," he said. "Before you ever invested." That made no sense. The whole pitch had been steady returns and assets. He'd looked successful. Eric took a breath. "I was in debt," he said. "Not normal debt. Not credit cards. I owe people." People. The way he said it made my stomach tighten. The second major twist was that Eric hadn't been running a scheme for greed alone. He'd been paying off something older, something he'd never told anyone at work. He explained in careful, clipped sentences. Years earlier, he'd gotten involved with sports betting through someone he thought was a friend. It escalated. Losses grew. He borrowed to cover, then borrowed more. Eventually, it wasn't a bookie. It was a group that didn't care about repayment plans. "They threatened my wife," he said. "My kid." I stared at him. "So you stole from us to pay criminals?" Eric nodded, jaw clenched. "I told myself it was temporary," he said. "I told myself I'd flip one property, make it right and stop. But every time I got close, something went wrong. And I kept using new money to keep the plate spinning." He said he'd tried to get out. He said he'd gone to the police once and been told it would be hard to prove and dangerous. He said he felt trapped. And then he said the sentence that recontextualized my earlier conflict with him in the hallway. "You were the one who made me nervous," he said. "Not because you were wrong, because you were going to make me stop, and stopping meant they'd come for me." I felt something shift inside me. Anger tangled with a grim understanding. He'd seen my questions as a threat to his survival, not just to his scam. That didn't excuse what he did, but it explained why his charm had turned sharp when I pushed. I asked him why he disappeared instead of confessing. Eric stared at his coffee like it held answers. "Because they told me to," he said. I felt cold spread through my chest. "Who told you to?" "The people I owed," he said. "They realized the investigation was coming. They said I had to vanish. They took my phone, my car, everything. They moved me around. I was useful." Useful. The word sat there like a bad smell. I asked, "Why are you here now?" Eric's eyes flicked to me. "Because I got out," he said. "Because I finally have leverage." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small USB drive. He set it on the table between us like a coin. "It's records," he said. "Names. Transactions. Proof." I stared at it. "Why give it to me?" "Because you're the one they can't dismiss," he said. "You're the responsible guy. You kept statements. You asked questions. You'll do it right." I felt a bitter laugh rise. "So now you want me to clean up your mess?" Eric nodded once. "Yes," he said. "And because I owe you." The third twist was realizing that the disappearance wasn't just shame or avoidance. Eric had been controlled, and now he was trying to use me as a tool the way he'd used our money. And the uncomfortable part was that he wasn't wrong about my role. I was the one who could make the story believable to authorities. My credibility was a kind of currency. I took the USB drive home and sat at my desk staring at it like it was radioactive. My wife watched me from the doorway, face tight. "This is a trap," she said. It might be evidence, I said. It might be a way to drag us into something worse, she said. She was right. And still, I felt something else underneath. A sick satisfaction that Eric had finally acknowledged my competence. That my carefulness mattered. That was my moral failure in the present. My willingness to touch something dangerous because it validated the identity I'd been trying to reclaim. I contacted the investigator from the old case. He was surprised to hear from me. He agreed to meet. When I handed over the USB drive, he didn't smile. He said, "Where did you get this?" I hesitated. Then I told him. Not everything, just that Eric had reached out. The investigator's expression hardened. "You should not have met him alone," he said. "And you should not have brought this home." Too late. Within a week, I was interviewed by federal agents. They asked about my investment, my communications, my meeting. They treated me politely but not warmly. Politeness is not reassurance. They said the information on the drive involved more than our local fraud case. It suggested connections to a broader financial crime network. Money laundering, offshore transfers, shell companies. I felt my stomach drop. I thought Eric's scheme was a small-time con. It was bigger, or at least connected to bigger. The fourth twist was realizing my loss wasn't an isolated mistake. It had been a small tributary feeding a larger river of dirty money. For a brief, stupid moment, I believed we might get our money back. The agents didn't promise it, but they said asset seizures were possible. They used words like restitution. I started calculating again. I started thinking about the $60,000, about the interest, about how we could refill the college fund. That was the second false resolution, the idea that justice could look like a check. Then the collapse began, not with a dramatic event, but with my employer. My job required a security clearance for certain contracts. Not government level, but enough that being involved in a federal investigation, even as a victim, triggered review. HR called me in. They were sympathetic in voice and cold in action. "We're placing you on leave pending outcome," they said. "It's procedural." Procedural meant my income paused while my mortgage stayed due. My wife stared at me that night with a look that wasn't anger anymore. It was exhaustion. "This is what I meant," she said softly. "You keep thinking you can manage danger if you hold it carefully." I didn't have a defense. I had a USB drive, a stack of legal documents, and a bank account that started shrinking again. Eric disappeared a second time, but this time it was different. It wasn't silence. It was absence with a shadow. Agents told me they couldn't locate him. They wouldn't say more. My calls to the burner number he'd used went nowhere. Then, one evening, a car I didn't recognize sat across the street from our house for 2 hours. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was a neighbor's guest. But it sat there too still, and my skin prickled with the kind of instinct you get when you've invited trouble close enough to smell. My wife noticed too. She closed curtains. She checked locks twice. I told the agents. They said, "If you feel in danger, call local police." It was the kind of instruction that sounds helpful until you realize how little it does against people who don't fear paperwork. That night, I slept with my phone on my chest like a talisman. In the morning, the car was gone. The street looked normal. Birds, lawns, a man walking his dog. Normality is what makes fear feel crazy. I started to regret taking the drive at all. Not because I wanted to protect Eric, but because I wanted my life back in its small, controlled shape. But there was no going back. Once money pulls you into a story, it doesn't ask if you're ready for the next chapter. Months passed. My leave extended. Our savings thinned. We dipped into retirement accounts and paid penalties I'd spent years avoiding. Every withdrawal felt like tearing fabric. Then, finally, the agents contacted me. They said there had been arrests. They said assets had been seized. They said restitution would be limited. Limited meant not much. When the restitution check arrived, it was for $3,412. 17. I stared at it until my eyes burned. The number was almost insulting in its precision. It didn't change anything. It didn't restore anything. It was a token that proved the system had noticed us. I deposited it anyway, because refusing it wouldn't make me noble. it would just make me poorer. The investigator told me, quietly, that Eric was presumed dead. Not officially, not a body, but enough indicators that they'd stopped expecting to find him alive. I felt something I didn't expect. Not grief, exactly, but a hollow guilt mixed with relief. Relief that the threat might be gone. Guilt that relief existed at all. I kept thinking of the diner booth, the USB drive, the way he said I was the one who could make the story believable. I wondered if he'd known he was walking toward an ending and wanted to leave something behind. I went back to work eventually, in a reduced role with a quiet understanding that my career had a ceiling now. My wife and I stayed together, but the trust between us became something we maintained deliberately, like a garden that will die if you stop paying attention. We never recovered the money. Not really. We recovered functioning. Sometimes I tell people I lost money in a bad investment, and they nod sympathetically like it's a common adult mistake. That's the neat version. The truth is messier. I hid it from my wife, I let pride guide my decisions, and I took a second risk because I wanted to feel like my carefulness was still a virtue instead of a costume. Eric's disappearance used to feel like the story's climax. Now it feels like a warning shot I ignored. The shocking truth wasn't only that he was deeper in debt than I knew or that criminals were involved. It was that money didn't just reveal his character. It revealed mine. I used to believe that if you kept your finances tidy, your life would stay tidy. Now I know that money is less like a tool and more like a force. It moves through people and it pulls at whatever weak parts are already there: fear, pride, the desire to be seen as competent. You can resist it for a while. You can tell yourself you're different. Then one day you're sitting at your kitchen table with a check for $3,412. 17, a marriage that feels thinner than it used to, and an empty space where a friend's face should be. And the unsettling part is that there's no clean lesson to take from it, only the quiet realization that the numbers you track don't measure the debts that actually follow you.